Now, forgive me if you see me looking up and down, like I mentioned last episode. Let me just get this situated right here. This is what we call Evil Exposed, all right? This is a part of a larger podcast that I do with my co-host Delilah, where I talk about the psychological profiles of criminals, especially the criminal cases we cover in the Scandinavian Nordic region. So, this is, also let me mention as well before I forget, we do the podcast every Monday. So every Monday, you're going to see an episode drop on your podcasting platforms like Apple, Spotify, all the platforms we are located on, as well as these YouTube videos where you can find these, videos. So are the podcast episodes put online via YouTube since Google transitioned this way. All right, then. So welcome to episode 2. I think I figured out that every 3 weeks would be a good idea for me to upload videos like this, something casual. As you can see, I'm wearing my bonnet, nothing too crazy, just have a little lamp on here on my computer table if you can see it through my glasses, and we'll just kind of vibe and talk about true crime and how insane people really can be. Okay? All right. So I'm going to look at some notes here. And obviously I'll cut through some stills and stuff like that as I make certain references. And here we go. So today is about John Wolfgang Alexander Ausonius. Now, this was, I think, another episode we had covered in, I think, season 1. If I remember correctly, it was season 1, early season 1. This was a dude who was known as the Laser Man. So he was a convicted Swedish serial killer and a bank robber. He had gained notoriety in the 90s, and his racial motivated attacks were kind of centered around his distorted idea of self, as well as his desire to fit in. And also he was robbing banks because, money. But this is kind of like a more deep dive into a comprehensive kind of discussion about why he had these conflicts with themselves, why he was dealing with immigrants himself, people, all that. And it gives you an idea of what was going on in Sweden at the time, the progression of these xenophobic ideologies. And this is kind of like the beginning, the early stages of really, seeing what's going on with that. Because if nowadays, Sweden's actually progressing in a very interesting way, almost identical to some of the events that's happened in the United States, except it's happening over a shorter period of time. But I'm not going to discuss all that. All right. So let's get a little bit of background about our character, right? Shall we? So he was born July 12th, 1953 in Lidingö, Sweden. Now, if I butcher any places or names on the podcast, I try my best to say it as well, but I do not know the Swedish language. I am going to learn at some point, I guess. But he was a German immigrant, right? So he grew up in a relatively stable middle-class home, the typical run-of-the-mill kind of guy. And, his parents eventually divorced when he was young. So divorce can definitely be a factor, and probably was a factor in some of the things that transpired in his, in why he became what he became. And ultimately, it did play a part into his development psychologically. But he went to school, had a typical life, various careers. He worked as a taxi driver, and on top of that, he was studying engineering. Now, he was described as intelligent. There was nothing wrong with him intellectually, but also he had difficulties with social interactions, which kind of give us a little bit of a clue that he probably had some form of maybe minor mental illness. Maybe he could have been on the autism spectrum. Social interactions can be one of those situations, or just social anxiety. It could be anything, but I'm pretty sure that was definitely involved as well. So as he had gotten older, he struggled with his identity. It became very apparent that he was of mixed heritage. He was both German and Swedish. His mother was German and the dad was Swedish, and he strongly identified as Swedish to try and fit in with the people that he was, surrounded with. He was insecure about his identity, and this is one of the major factors that contributed to his crimes and why he felt the way that he felt against immigrants, to the point he was even, acting and voting against immigrants, even though he himself was a child of one. So he had this thing where he was like, yeah, pure Swedish, pure Swedish. Yeah, that was his thing. He believed that anyone who wasn't pure Swedish was an outsider, which made him a hypocrite because he was himself not pure Swedish. So he went on these racially motivated sprees in Sweden in 1991 and in 1992, in which he killed one person and injured about like 10 other people. It took place in Stockholm. And he was serving a life sentence in Sweden for using a rifle with a laser sight, hence the nickname, as we, mentioned in the podcast, the Laser Man. So his aim was trash because he just had a makeshift setup for his gun, and that just didn't work out. Anyways, so some of the characteristics that even briefly were mentioned in this very summarized version of this episode was that he had like this social alienation kind of thing going on with himself. So he felt socially alienated and struggled with forming meaningful relationships, which made him feel it's like an infinite cycle of loneliness. And later, this fueled his ideologies and his violent behavior, and thus creating the monster that we saw. Now, his racial identity, like I've mentioned during the story, although he was of mixed heritage, having a German mother and a Swedish dad, he primarily identified as a Swedish person, but he had like these super racist views against, anyone who was non-Swedish. Didn't matter if he was white per se, just if you were non-Swedish, which he later acted upon when he decided to shoot all those people. Now, his attacks were obviously racially motivated, but they also targeted people based on if he can identify you specifically as an outsider. So even if you were white, typically a lot of Swedish people tend to have like the blue eyes, blonde hair situation. Not all of them, but some. And Sweden now has like a mixture of different types of white people in there now because of just how immigration works. But his rationale behind this whole thing was he believed that he was protecting the Swedish society from like foreign influence, which is impossible because in the 90s, just like any other country, the internet was beginning to become more prevalent. So outside influence can be brought into the country from online. So of course that was going to be a thing. Now, before he even bothered to do the attacks, it was super well planned in terms of he meticulously planned them. And it kind of indicated how intelligent as well as organized he was and how premeditated this attack truly was. And he acquired weapons, he got the laser sight and the rifle and all that, right? And he conducted even surveillance on potential victims, which, showed how dedicated and methodical he was about this whole entire plan. So between August 1991 and 1992, he shot 11 people, killing one, injured several others. His attacks were precise, and it was, at least in theory, would have went off well if his aim wasn't very trash, only injuring a lot. But in addition to his attacks, he was robbing banks where he wanted to maintain or kind of fund this lifestyle that he felt like he deserved. And it's kind of interesting how, he was intelligent. He was studying to be an engineer. He didn't like immigrants, but then he felt he deserved the money of other people. And the money in the banks were also from other Swedish citizens. So you see that there's even more of a contradiction on like two different levels. He himself is a child of an immigrant, but also he was stealing money from other Swedish people who then would probably, once they found out who it was like, hey, he's the child of an immigrant, and then kind of fueling their ideologies against him. So he's kind of proving some negative ideologies because he felt like he deserved money. I don't know. But that was his rationale. So he felt like he deserved it. Now, one of the things that I think I discussed in the podcast episode was that he did display some bits of antisocial personality disorder, where he had this like lack of empathy. He disregarded social norms. He struggled socially, and he seemed to have a higher propensity of committing crimes. So you can tell that there was something going on even as a child. And I think the divorce and maybe just also the insecurities exacerbated those things, which is why, he ended up developing the way that he developed. So he also had a sense of superiority complex. So there was a dash of narcissism there, having entitlement, believing, oh, this money belongs to me. I deserve to have a lifestyle, even though he could have worked hard just like anybody else. He was just like, I'm gonna steal this money. That's how he felt. So there we go. Now, what's interesting is that when he got arrested, right, they did conduct extensive investigations, eventually identifying him through witness testimony and forensic evidence, obviously. And then he was once again arrested, like I mentioned before, June 1992, where he initially denied doing the crime. But even when he was denying it, he planned a lot of things, but because people saw him, they knew it was him. So it was almost like he was so like high on his horse, he didn't realize that he made a ton of mistakes. For a lack of a better term, a shit ton of mistakes. So basically left plenty of evidence, left eyewitness testimony, people who can identify him. And that's where this whole debacle came from, where him getting caught and being convicted of multiple charges, including murder, attempted murder, and bank robbery, and received a life sentence. And then reflecting on the severity of his premeditated nature of his crimes, and kind of life went on after that in terms of the attack itself. But I want to say, as a cautionary tale, right? Having this sense of identity crisis, it shows how it's important, like, people, not only we understand why people end up this way, right? But also why we should understand reasoning. I'm not saying you should agree with what happened. I'm saying you should understand the reasoning, because people have to understand, no matter where you are on the planet, even as an immigrant, there are other people, other cultures out there. And to be a well-rounded human being, you have to accept other people's cultures, understand that their cultures are different, and the world does not revolve around you. But unfortunately, due to some ideologies that came a lot more prevalent during the times of conquering and this purity mentality, people feel like, okay, well, I'm superior, because whatever reasoning they have in their head, when in reality, we're all living on a planet that's floating through an infinitely expanding abyss of darkness, and where we all will be born, live life, die, we have to eat, we all have pretty much, the same fundamental beginning, middle, and end. And ultimately, no matter how you treat people, no matter what you do to people, no matter what you do for yourself, or doesn't matter what you do in life, ultimately with time, everything fades. So why treat people like trash, thinking you're better, when in reality, we're no better than each other. We all have the same destination at the end of the day. And I know it sucks to hear it, but just be kinder to people, be better and get help. This sense of identity confliction doesn't just exist in people who kill, but it can exist even in friend groups. People who have no sense of identity and they get lost in another ideology because they have no sense of self. We're seeing it presently today in politics, not just in America, but we're seeing it all over the world. So be mindful of who you are. And if you feel like you don't know who you are, that's okay, because that's what life is about. But be sure to explore that, go out and journey into the world, understand the things you like, don't like, the traits that are inherent to you versus traits that you've picked up from other people, and just be kinder to other people. But if you want to get more detail about the episode, go check it out on the podcasting platform. Like I said, every Monday it will drop. In terms of Eastern Standard Time, it drops 2 a.m. every morning. Well, roughly around 2:30, because it takes a while for the episodes to come out on the platforms. But around 2:30, and then I think 8 a.m. every morning when it's like, in Sweden, Norway, that part of the world. So I hope you enjoyed a relatively brief breakdown and discussion. And please be kinder, and let's all just work on ourselves to be better people. And I'll holla at y'all in 3 weeks. Or if you're on the podcast, I'll see you Monday. Peace out. Okay, hello there.